Okay, hello. Hi. This is Gregory Muna, aka Master Mu, and this is our intermittent podcast. This today is 25th, and for those of you who are watching in the UK, happy bank holiday, and for those in U.S. We have Labor Day weekend coming up, but this is our August 25th edition of Art is the Church of God, the Creator. And in our last edition, we were discussing we gave an update for Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, and we'll be doing that again in our next edition. But today, I want to get back to our previous topic of the Mandala Principle in Buddhist art, and the deepening the connections to our Western sacred and secular traditions, and in the going all the way back in the Western secular, well, actually, it's on the borderline between sacred and secular, with the Pythagorean tradition, because originally the Pythagoreans were a religious cult, and then they began transformed through Plato's interpretation into just a part of mainstream philosophy and Neoplatonism. So the Pythagorean ideas of the sacredness of number and the sort of the sensory perception of number as fundamental to our humanity is we've been looking at. Previously, we discussed the sort of Pythagorean triad, this is the idea of threeness in relation to the later Christian idea of the Trinity, right? Essential sort of cosmic threeness, and then we were moving on to the Pythagorean pentad, which is the number five, and the perceptual unit of fiveness, and from the Pythagorean perspective, there's the sacredness of the fiveness in our perception, and we were discussing how that relates to the fiveness embedded in the traditional Asian, in the traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism, but throughout of the idea of the mandala, where there is basically a circular matrix with the four terminal points, the four cardinal points, north, south, east, west, and center being the fifth, and how that is a fundamental way of visualizing spatial perception. And so in our previous podcast, which you can go back in the archive, we were discussing how threeness, whether that's in the Pythagorean triad or in the Christian Trinity, is fundamentally related to our perception of time, past, present, and future, that we instinctively, intuitively conceptualize our passage through time in terms of past moments, present moments, and future moments. And this is because of the scientific truth of the second law of thermodynamics, which is that we are compound superatomic material, living beings which have beginning, middle, and end, and are constantly moving towards entropy, which is to say dissolution for living beings. Unfortunately, the transition from birth, life to death. So we subconsciously interpret time in those terms. We would not interpret time that way if we were somehow conscious on a subatomic level, because, as we all know, on the subatomic level, the arrow of entropy, it does not exist, and time does not have a definite direction. But on our level, it does. But we're not talking about the triad or the Trinity today. We're talking about the pentad or the mandala, and the five-pointed image of spatial perception, and how we intuitive that, and how that relates to our artistic practice. And of course, it's very obvious when we think of mandala, we think of visual art, because mandalas are famously, paintings, Tibetan tankas. You may be familiar with the term tanka, visual representations of circles and so on, and and the colors and so on. But what I am going to, my thesis is that that the fiveness of the Mandala Principle is also relevant not only to visual art, but to sonic art. And not only in the spatialization of sound. Of course, in space, we have, sound to the right, to the left, the front. We experience sound spatially. And of course, how do we know that? Because we have two ears, and our brains create from our sort of stereophonic hearing, our brains create a three-dimensional model of acoustic space. In the same way that our brains use the information from our two eyes, right and left, our stereoscopic vision, and then that gets interpreted in our cerebral cortex into a three-dimensional model of visual space, right? So, like our visual sense of three-dimensional space, we have a sonic sense of three-dimensional space because of the way we hear and the way our brain processes sonic information. And because of our experience of three-dimensional space, we have there's a fundamental fiveness to this that I was discussing in the Mandala Principle: front, back, right hand, left hand, center. This is how we, as embodied beings, again, this is because we have a body. We are physical. I am alive. You are alive right now, hopefully. And so we have bodies that have bilateral symmetry. We talked about that. And we have a front side and a back side and a right and a left. And we, again, intuitively, subconsciously, interpret space in terms of these 5 points and where we are in relationship to them. So for that reason, conscious organisms that occupy a bilateral body are always going to have an intuitive relationship to fiveness because of these 5 points. In a hypothetical situation, in another, solar system or another, universe, or within different, laws of physics, there might be conscious beings that do not inhabit bodies, and then they probably would not experience space in the way that we do. But we are in this universe under these laws of physics, and we are inhabiting bodies. So this is how so for the sake of argument, we're saying this is inherent. And it is universal as far as we are concerned. And since there is no scientific evidence of any other conscious matter existing in the universe besides us, we've never been contacted by any other sort of conscious entities, we can assume that it is universally true because it's true for us, and it hasn't been contradicted elsewise. So we're going to proceed from that point of view of mandala as a universal sort of experience of energy, and its artistic representation in all arts, and specifically in music. Now, what is fiveness in music? I'll be coming back to this over and over again. All right, but threeness in music is represented by the ratios of 3 to 1, 3 to 2, and so on, which we talked about being sort of the fundamental tonic and dominant polarity of sonic perception of all Western music, of music altogether, of the perfect fifth. The fiveness in music is we experience as in terms of mathematical ratios on the most basic level: 5 to 1, 5 to 2, 5 to 4. Those are what we perceive of as the major interval, as the diatonic major third, and we can, for the time being, we can table discussions of why we prefer to hear the 5/4 interval as the major third over the Pythagorean 81/64. But I think the number giveaway right there is that 5/4 major third is an immediately assimilable, perceivable unit. The multiple is only 20, whereas 81/64, well, I don't have my calculator out. That's a much higher number, and that's much more difficult to perceive. And that's why if you put 5/4 major third up against the 81/64 major third, the 5/4 major third is always going to sound consonant, and the 81/64, the so-called Pythagorean major third, will always sound out of tune. All right, because our ears always focus on the lowest possible prime ratio. We're always seeking out the lowest possible primes. Of course, the prime numbers 2, 3, 5, 7, so we're always trying to get as close as possible to the 2, and relationships as close as possible to the 2. So the 2 in relationship to 3, 5, occasionally 7. But as we go up that chain, it becomes more and more difficult to perceive. And then now what you're hearing for example, if you just listen to the sonic patterns that I've visualized with the oscilloscope below, are some mixtures of lower and higher primes, which I've specifically chosen for their expressive qualities, for their emotional and psychological quality, and rhythmic structures, which speak to me expressively. And I hope they speak to you. But, your mileage may vary, and chacun a son goût, and beauty is in the ears of the beholder, and all of that. So I try to share only what I consider to be beautiful to me, and I hope it's beautiful to you. But that's nothing is universal. There are I've seen plenty of people for whom the most beautiful music of Beethoven, Bach, or Mozart just sounds like noise, So you can't tell people what to appreciate. I'm not going to tell you what to appreciate. You have to develop that yourself, your own personal sense of aesthetic. To my way of thinking, every time I'm dealing with a 5-based harmony or rhythm, any group of 5, to me, is an expression of the Mandala Principle. And what we talked about previously is that from the Jungian, from the perspective of the great Carl Jung, that the mandala, sort of the Asian Buddhist mandala, is actually expressed in the Christian symbol of the cross, because the cross has the 4 points, the top, the bottom, the right, the left, and the center, which also represent the body of the living deity of Christ, the head, the feet, the right hand, the left hand, the heart. So according to Jung, and I agree with Jung's perception, the cross should be perceived of as a living mandala, an embodied mandala, a mandala matrix superimposed upon the idea of the human body, and that within the Christian context of Christian contemplation of contemplating the cross and the body of Christ, that you're also contemplating the Mandala Principle. So this is I encourage everyone to read Jung's, not only his books on the dream interpretation, but also especially in archetypes, but especially his great book on mandala symbolism. And from there, expand your own reading. Read the works of Jose Arguelles, Ken Wilber, and various other charlatans like myself. I am a self-proclaimed charlatan, but I'm a benevolent charlatan in the sense that most charlatans are psychopathic and are trying to pick your pockets. I'm not trying to pick your pocket. I'm simply putting out there what seems true and meaningful to me, and I'm not bothering with footnotes, and I'm not presenting myself as an expert, as a specialist. I'm presenting myself simply as a human being who has read, contemplated, meditated over my lifetime, and I'm sharing what I have with you. Take it or leave it. And if you want to view that as just crackpot charlatanism, that's fine. If you find it valuable, that's also fine. I hope you find it valuable. All right. So, as beginning our deep dive into the Pythagorean pentad, the Jungian cross as mandala, I'm going to be referring extensively to the mandala teachings and the Dharma art teachings of my teacher, my first teacher of meditation, not my very first meditation instructor, but my first teacher of bringing together meditation with artistic practice. That was Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and I studied with him from 1985 to 1987, just a brief period. And then after that, I studied with his students, Allen Ginsberg and Ann Waldman and others. And, and I continued to study up to this day. So it's a very, very long journey over the past 40 years. Yes, I'm an old person. And so I want to start with a couple of talks that Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche gave in 1972, long before I met him. I mean, I was barely alive, in Karmacholing in Vermont in 1972, and then connect that to his contemporary reflections on Dharma art. I want to put sort of side by side, create a kind of a dialectical commentary in between the Chogyam Trungpa's mandala teachings and his Dharma art teachings, and then trying to connect them with my own perspectives. So let's go, and I'll try not to be too overbearing or pedantic, but as is my wont. Okay, so part one, a mandala of unconditioned energy, was a talk given in Karmacholing in Vermont, near Barnet, Vermont, in case anyone's there. Shout out to Vermont. We love Vermont. In 1972. And this first talk was entitled Orderly Chaos. And Orderly Chaos is also the name of the collection of these talks, which you can purchase from Shambhala Publications. And so I want to, again, clarify that these I am reading, I'm quoting from another author, copyrighted works of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and I'm simply giving my commentary. And so these are not my words, they're his, but they speak to my heart, and I hope they speak to your heart as well. Okay, so it seems that there has been a lot of misunderstanding in the way the basic principle of mandala has been presented to people. Therefore, it is worth working further on the idea of mandala. What is mandala? Why is mandala? How is mandala? This involves working with our life situation, our basic existence, our whole being. To begin with, we should discuss the idea of orderly chaos, which is the Mandala Principle. It is orderly because it comes in a pattern. It is chaos because it is confusing to work with that order. Okay, so this is really crucial to my musical practice, so I just want to repeat that idea. The idea, we should discuss the idea of orderly chaos, which is the Mandala Principle. It is orderly because it comes in a pattern. It is chaos because it is confusing to work with that order. So in my works, in my musical and audiovisual works, you may experience orderly chaos, and you may experience the Mandala Principle, and you may experience the orderly pattern, you may experience the chaos, which is confusing. If you experience confusion, that may be the chaotic aspect. Okay? Some people have commented, and I'm responding to your comments. I've got the screen open here for live comments, and I'm responding to comments as we go. Okay. Getting back to Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche's transcript, he continues. He says, the Mandala Principle includes the Mandala of Samsara and the Mandala of Nirvana, which are equal and reciprocal. If we do not understand the samsaric aspect of the mandala, There is no nirvanic aspect of mandala at all. Okay, so again, just in terms of terminology for people who are, non-Buddhist or non-meditators or just, arriving new. Again, mandala, 5 points, the 5-pointed spatial matrix, right, of the 4 outer points in the center point. Samsara, nirvana. Samsara, suffering, propelled by karma. Nirvana, non-suffering, when there is no more karmic impulsivity, right? And so he says here, samsara and nirvana are equal and reciprocal. Equal and reciprocal. So the idea that our meditation practice is just going to get us to like 100% nirvana, that's a delusion, because nirvana and samsara are equal and reciprocal. As much nirvana as there is as much samsara as there is. As much karmic impulsivity and drives and aggression and passion and self-destruction as there is just as much of that in release and joy and non-impulsivity, non-self-destruction, non-aggression. Okay, again, my commentary. Let's get back to my teacher's words. The idea of orderly chaos is that we are confused methodically. In other words, the confusion is intentional. It is intentional in that we deliberately decide to ignore ourselves. We decide to boycott wisdom and enlightenment. We want to get on with our trips, with our passion, aggression, and so forth. Because of that, we create a mandala, a self-existing circle. Because of that, we create a mandala, a self-existing circle. So Trungpa Rinpoche just gave a further definition of mandala as a self-existing circle. Self-existing in the sense that it is inherent in our perceptual apparatus. We have no choice but to view our existence as a self-existing circle with these 4 points, the mandala. Yeah. It could be, we might draw a comparison to the idea of a self-existing circle, the mandala, as inherent, and we might view that as the categorical priors of Kant, right? Except that Kant says that we can never get past that to the Ding an sich, to the noumenon, and that's incorrect. We can get past our perceptual apparatus to the Ding an sich. We can get to actual unmediated pure perception, unmediated pure cognition, unmediated non-dual, the pure drives, pure emotions, and pure autonomic functions. We actually can, but we'll talk about this. Right now we're focusing on perceptions and the 5ness of perceptions embedded in the Mandala Principle. And again, we're trying to connect that to our musical perception and therefore our musical practice, at least as I experience it as a composer. The fundamental experience of the tonic in relation to the major third degree, the defining degree of the diatonic scale, as a melodic element, as opposed to the fundamental harmonic element, as we were talking about last time, of the 5 against the 1, right? Okay. All right, so back to our talk. Because of that, we create a mandala, a self-existing circle. We create ignorance deliberately. Then we create perception, consciousness, name and form, sense consciousness, touch, feeling, desire, copulation, the world of existence, birth, old age, and death. Okay? So all of this comes out of the mandala of deception, of dualism, or duality taken as actual, right? So delusional dualism, because we create ignorance deliberately. So perception, consciousness, name and form, sense consciousness, touch, feeling, desire, those are all related to our five fundamental faculties: sense perceptions, smell, taste, touch, smell, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and consciousness. There's perception, consciousness, and which is to say the ability, rational, metacognition, name and form, symbolic orders, right? And then the drives: copulation, birth, aggression, desire, right? And then existence, birth, old age, sickness, and death. Those are the autonomic functions, right? Which is to say, breathing, heartbeat, metabolic function are the completely unconscious things which keep us functioning as living beings. Okay, so that is how we create how of mandala, how we create mandala in our daily existence as it is. Okay, so Trungpa's point here is that we are constantly creating a mandala in every moment of our life, whether we are aware of it or not. Okay, whether it's conscious or not. He says, I would like to present the Mandala Principle from this everyday angle, so that it becomes something workable rather than something purely philosophical or psychological, a Buddhist version of theology. This is very important, that we're this fiveness of the mandala and of the cross, presenting it as just an inherent part and parcel of our existence as humans, not as a mystical trip, not as a visionary. I mean, it can also appear in visionary, but it only appears in visionary experience because it's embedded in our everyday experience, because it is underlying truth of our existence. There's nothing spacey or trippy about it. If anything I say comes off as spacey or trippy because of my language, then I apologize. I'm trying to convey as directly as possible my actual experience that is true in my experience, and I'm putting it out there because I think it's probably also true in your experience. I hope it's true in your experience, and I would like to create a dialogue with those of us who have similarly true experiences. Okay? So, he says here, so the Mandala Principle in the everyday angle, something workable rather than something purely philosophical or psychological or theological. From this point of view, orderly chaos is orderly because we create the groundwork of this mandala. We relate to it as the ground on which we can play our game of hypocrisy and bewilderment. This game is usually known as ignorance, which is threefold: ignorance of itself, ignorance born within, and the ignorance of compulsion, or ignorance of immediate measure. In the third ignorance, having developed a sense of separation from the ground, there is a feeling that we immediately have to do something about it. So that's compulsion. Right? Like you've got to do something right now. All right? And fundamental ignorance. Since mandala is based on our ignorance and confusion, there is no point in discussing it unless we know who we are and what we are. All right, this is very important. Again, we're taking a sort of a samsaric perception of mandala, not a nirvana. We're starting with samsara, which is where we are in delusion, and saying that mandala emerges out of delusion, and then also we can see it from a perspective, a non-delusional perspective. But we're starting with the ground, which is delusion. And there is no point in discussing divinities, talking about which ones are located in which part of mandala diagrams, and about the principles that might quite possibly awaken us from our confusion into the awakened state. It would be ludicrous to discuss those things at this point, completely out of the question. We have to know first what mandala is, why mandala is, and why such a notion of enlightenment exists at all. So in other words, mandala is fiveness, right? The Pythagorean pentad. We have to know what fiveness, the pentad, is, why fiveness is, why such a notion of enlightenment exists at all. And in the Christian Jungian symbolism of the cross, we have to know what the cross is, why the cross is, and why such a notion as the notion of enlightenment exists at all. And in the Christian context, you can substitute enlightenment for salvation. Okay? And I'm not drawing a line between the two. You may, I'm not. The idea of enlightenment or salvation is born out of confusion. Because somebody is confused, there is the other aspect that contrasts with that confusion, which is enlightenment. And again, if we translate that into in purely Christian theological terms, we can substitute for enlightenment salvation, and confusion we can substitute sinfulness, in the sense of original sin, or the propensity towards sinfulness, as opposed to the sin of commission, actual acts of injustice, the propensity to act delusionally out of confusion, the sort of fundamental sinfulness, right? Okay, back to the text. We have to approach this scientifically. If confusion exists, then enlightenment exists. Therefore, confusion exists. We have to work with this polarity. All right? Again, because of the way our minds work, we perceive things in terms of these liminal pairs. That doesn't, the pairness, the opposition, apparent opposition of enlightenment and confusion is how our minds work. It's how we are able to conceptualize things. But that does not imply a separation or an opposition. It simply shows that this is a perceptual unit, and we can understand this non-dually. We can understand this liminal pair not in terms of dualism, but we can understand it as a polarity. This is the term that Trungpa uses. And moving commentary back to the transcript. Okay, so again, back to the words of Chogyam Trungpa. There is a sense of space constantly. There is a sense of space because there is a boundary measuring the space. In other words, if we had some land and we wanted to make a definite statement that it was our land, we would have to put up a fence around it. The fence would mean that this particular area belonged to us and that we wanted to work on that basis. With this approach, we get onto our land, we relate with it, and we begin to possess it. It belongs to us. Then we develop that sense of possession to the point where it is absolutely, absolutely impossible to work any further in that way. That space of our land becomes solid space. It is our land. It completely belongs to us. The whole land is ours. This sense of ours automatically brings possessiveness, clinging to something, holding onto it. Holding onto it means solidifying that land that belongs to us. We concretize it as ours. We make it into concrete land, concrete space. We freeze the whole area. Okay, so again, my commentary is that that the Mandala Principle, the fiveness, this is a inherent experience of space. He says there is a sense of space constantly, and we exist. In other words, because of we are living beings and so on, we experience ourselves as existing in space. So we cannot escape our relationship to the idea of space. Okay. It's inherent in self-aware conscious existence. Okay. Back to the text. Consequently, the only thing left to relate with is the boundary, the fence. Okay, once we concretize space, it becomes frozen, so the only thing left to relate with is the boundary, the fence. That is the last hope we have. We begin to look into that as a way of relating further. Maybe the fence we set up originally might have some space in it. We begin trying to eat up that fence like a worm seeking territory or spaciousness. Since we have no relationship with our basic space as openness at all, we make the boundary into space. This turns the whole thing upside down, like turning positive film into negative. Everything black turns white, everything white turns black. The only way left for us to relate further is based on the hope that the fence might be a spacious one. It might be hollow, not a solid wall. That is how we set up a mandala situation to begin with our confused mind. So we experience space, we solidify it through confusion, and then there are the boundaries. And the mandala is like the sense of what are the boundary points, right? Okay, get back. Unfortunately, there is no point at all in relating with everything as beautiful and glorious as in a love and light trip. That would be totally ludicrous, if I may say so, impractical. If we are going to freeze the whole area that we have, then we have to relate with some other areas that might be space from that point of view. The proper introduction to mandala is to find out whether we are regarding the mandala as space or whether we are freezing that space and treating the situation around it as open space. And again, whenever I say mandala, this is my commentary, please in your mind substitute fiveness or the pentad or the cross. So we want to create a dialogue between these different perceptual systems. We want to say, like, we could also say the proper introduction to fiveness is to find out whether we are regarding the fiveness as space or whether we are freezing that space, right? We say the same thing about the cross. The proper introduction to the cross is to find out whether we're regarding the cross as space or whether we are freezing that space and treating the situation, right? Fiveness, pentad. So let's constantly use the equivalent terms and make those perceptual adjustments as we're reading and thinking about these terms. Okay? The whole thing could become quite workable. In other words, if nirvana exists, samsara exists equally. Are we going to relate with both together? Or are we just going to consider nirvana alone as workable and samsara as something we have to reject and destroy? This last kind of simple-minded approach is very confusing and in fact self-destructive. And that seems to be the point of relating with the Mandala Principle in terms of whether we have the ground to discuss it at all or not. What is the ground? Is the ground solid space or is the ground space? Okay, so again, in order to think in these terms properly, we have to accept the fact that we are self-destructive, neurotic, willful, impulsive, compulsive, all of these things. Anxiety. I certainly am. I mean, I am in therapy and probably will be in therapy the rest of my life. I have to deal with all of my impulsivity, all of my addictive tendencies, all of my self-destructive tendencies, and I don't mean to overshare or TMI, but I just think every adult has to do that. I just think this is the path of adulthood, and I work with it. I struggle with it. For me, every day is a constant struggle to be genuine, to not be a total jerk. And I feel that mostly I fail. Generally speaking, I mean, if I look back in the past, I try to stay focused in the present because I don't really think there's anything positive for me in imagining an idealized past or future. I don't want to look at the future either. I just want to stay as constructive and positive as I possibly can in the present and keep moving forward in constructive, positive present moment as much as I can without getting swallowed up by negativity. Okay, there's a bit of commentary after the talk here, which is very valuable. So let's take a look at it. Because it's sort of a meta commentary in addition to the commentary that I've been giving. Student, I don't understand what a mandala basically is. Trungpa Rinpoche. It is space to create a situation that is based on a territory or a boundary. It depends on whether we relate with space as space or space as solid, or with boundary as space, or the other way around. That's how it goes. Student, when you speak about the boundary of the mandala, it sounds like you were talking about the boundary of us or the mandala of us. When we go to explore the boundary of mandala, is that something like exploring our limits? Rinpoche. That depends on our attitude towards space, how we see it. Student, I see it as pretty solid. Rinpoche. Then the boundary becomes the space, which brings a tremendous struggle. Student, that comes from separating space and solidity? Trungpa, it's something like the lost wax method used by craftsmen. We expect the wax will act as the expression rather than what is inside it. It is exactly the same here. Experience becomes very claustrophobic, naturally, and then it depends on whether we accept the claustrophobia as it is or not. Student, it becomes claustrophobic in that we are surrounded by a boundary. Yes. Trungpa, yes. Student, what is it as it is? Trungpa, your guess is as good as mine. Student, are you describing an energy pattern of some kind? Trungpa, well, obviously, yes. There's energy involved in dealing with the texture of things as they are. But the question is, are we willing to relate with the space, or are we involved with the boundary? Are we willing to give up the whole trip of boundary and space and provide the basic ground? Student, isn't the space the same as the basic ground? Trungpa, it depends on how you look at it. Student, why is the mandala necessary? Can't we just get along as well without it? Trungpa, sure. We don't have a mandala at all. It's true, it's necessary. But that in itself becomes a mandala. Student, what does? Trungpa, the unnecessariness of it becomes a mandala. I mean, it's not a conceptual principle. It's what is. We don't have to call it a mandala or anything else, but it happens there. Student, is it an organizational energy? Rinpoche, sure. Anyway, there's some unity there and some pattern in it. The mandala is not important, but the mandala happens. Uh, just commentary. The mandala happens. It's self-existing. So whenever we hear sound, when we hear proportional vibrations of sound, the basic patterns emerge. The tonic, the fifth, the first degree, the third scale degree, the major third. These patterns emerge whether we want them to or not. Okay, at least that's what I try to represent in the pitch and the rhythmic patterns of my own music. Okay. Student, are you saying that when we are relating to space as concrete and trying to eat out from inside the boundary, then we are not seeing the mandala aspect of things, but when we relate to the open, spacious aspect of it, then we begin to relate to it as a mandala? Trungpa, it's up to you, purely up to you. There's no philosophical definition of it at all. What we are doing here is not trying to get together set patterns and ideas, ideologies, or theologies. We are not trying to develop a set idea of what a mandala is or isn't. We are more trying to relate to what a mandala might be or could be. There is no dogma involved at this point at all. It is more a question of developing a working basis for working together. Student, is that a way of looking at the world? Trungpa, I suppose you could say that, yes, but it would be more accurate to say that it's a way of seeing it. Student, so there is both a collective mandala and individual mandalas so that each of us, Trungpa, definitely, yes, that's how we perceive the world. Student, then our own personal mandala is subject to change as we change our consciousness and our way of seeing it. Trungpa, we don't change our consciousness. It's subject to how our consciousness grows. Student, could we be working on creating a mandala for the seminar group? Trungpa, sure, but you can't pin down the Mandala Principle as being this or that. We are discussing a totality in a blade of grass. Where there is grass growing, is that solid grass or is it hollow grass in the midst of concrete space? Do you see what I mean? Can anyone explain? Student, it's like the figure and ground relationship. Is the grass the figure and Trungpa? Yes. Do we describe the grass as outstanding in the midst of space, or do we say that the grass is the space and around the grass is the solidity? Do you see what I mean? Student, is it more accurate to describe what is by saying a blade of grass is a hollow thing with solidity all around it? Is that more accurate? Trungpa, I think that is more accurate, yes. Student, is it like the difference between simply considering a single thing and considering a total situation of the thing? Trungpa, both amount to the same thing because they are interdependent. You can't have just one or the other. Student, I don't understand what you mean by, quote, giving up the trip of space and providing the basic ground, unquote. Trungpa, that's giving up the whole thing with the interdependent elements, whether grass is the space or whether grass is the object. Student, giving up all that? Giving all that up? Trungpa, giving up that whole area. Then there is the possibility of some complete working basis. The tantric tradition on the Kriya Loka level talks about preparing the mandala with the 5 ingredients of a cow. The 5 ingredients of the cow are shit of a cow, piss of a cow, milk of a cow, and so forth. Clean up the holy ground with these, going beyond discrimination. Clean the ground completely with the 5 ingredients of a cow, then you can build a mandala on it or make sand painting or just lines. From the tantric point of view, that is the only workable situation. You have destroyed or overcome the hollow space or solid space in order to create the true mandala, the absolute mandala. This is not purely superstition, this Kriya Yoga idea of the 5 ingredients of a cow. The cow belongs to the earth. It grazes and sits and shits and eats grass and lives on the land. It has the quality of a sitting bull. And the 5 ingredients come out of that cow or sitting bull. It's a tremendously powerful thing to smear it all over the phenomenal world. The snot and the milk and piss and shit and everything. It's fantastic. It evens out the whole thing. It's beautiful. Student, is the ground the middle path? Trungpa, no. I wouldn't even say it's the middle path. There's nothing middle about it. It's the ground that does not allow any compromise. It's not in the middle. It's the ground. It has nothing to do with the middle at all. Student, could it just be dwelling on anything? Trungpa, I guess you could say that, but let me explain about the Mandala Principle as a whole. It is part of the tantric situation, the tantric approach. We are not discussing Madhyamaka or the Shunyata principle. Okay, so terminology here. Again, Mandala, fiveness. When Trungpa Rinpoche refers to the tantric situation, the tantric approach, he's talking about dealing with the subconscious and unconscious energies of passion, aggression, and ignorance, right? And he says we are not discussing Madhyamaka or Shunyata. It's not about Madhyamaka, analytical, or reason-based dialectics, or Shunyata, sort of meditative emptiness, right? In other words, formless meditation, right? So this is about dealing with the underlying drives, the passion, aggression, ignorance, and so on, right? And the fundamental existence, right? We are discussing the basic existence of things as they are, how we survive, how we live. So when he talks about the tantric principles, he's talking about the survival drives. It's the whole thing becomes less philosophical. There's no middle path involved. There's the total path. This is an absolutely heavy-handed approach to things as they are. There's no middle way at all. It's heavy-handed. Student, it seems that we haven't even approached the Madhyamaka level properly. How can we be working with what you were talking about without distorting it? Trungpa, we can do so theoretically, but from the point of view of actual practice, we should sit and meditate and work on ourselves in a basic fashion. Okay? So I'll repeat that. From the point of view of actual practice, we should sit and meditate and work on ourselves in a basic fashion. What I try to do when I listen to music is that I try not to, this is my commentary, I try not to space out or self-medicate, which is mostly what I've been doing my whole life. But I really try to sit with the sound and meditate on the sound and work on myself in a basic fashion. So I hope you do the same. I hope that when you listen to my music or perform my music or look at my animations, that you are sitting and meditating with that audio-visual perception, whatever that is, just maybe the auditory or the visual. And while you're doing that, by doing that, you are working on yourself in a basic fashion. That's okay. Back to the text. Trungpa, what we are discussing is the possible chaos that might happen, the orderly chaos that might happen as we go along the path. This seminar could be regarded as a warning session. Somebody who hasn't yet learned how to drive can still study the highway codes and how to relate with motor cars. It is possible that chaos, orderly chaos, might happen in our situation. In that regard, I personally feel that I can trust the American audience, composed of those who are on the path or might be on the path. I feel brave enough to tell them what the path is all about. I feel that I can relate with them and I can explain the possibilities of order and chaos. I feel telling them about it might create some awakeness on the path. It's a situation of preparing the whole ground rather than purely a matter of immediate instruction. You have to commit yourself to the path and surrender yourself to it. You have to take refuge, become a refugee to begin with, give up everything. Then you have to be willing to take that responsibility of a bodhisattva. Okay, again, in Buddhist terms, a bodhisattva is a being who has attained a certain level of realization, who is committed to helping others forever, right? Then after that, the parallel Christian term is a saint, right? Then after that, you can receive the tantric teachings. But that seems to be a long way off as far as we are concerned, okay? So before we can think about sainthood, we have to think about working with our delusion, our neurosis, our impulsivity, our etc., our self-destructive tendencies. Nevertheless, it is worth discussing the possibility of these situations occurring for all of us. Student, does the basic ground come about when you somehow forget about this and that, the discrimination? Is that what we are implying? Trungpa, yes. Student, and this is experiential, not just intellectual. Trungpa, yes. Student, how do you know when you've experienced it? Trungpa, it's purely up to you. Student, it seems to me there could be some self-deception. Trungpa, if you are experiencing things completely and totally, that means you have worn out your reference point. That is a total experience. Student, worn out your reference point? Trungpa, as though you are completely dead, or at least dying. You have no way of referring to anything alive. You are actually dying. It's very solid and very simple. That's very interesting. I would, in terms of commentary, I would just mention this basic awareness of mortality as fundamental. I would refer to, I'm paraphrasing Heidegger, who says that authentic being is sein zur Todes, being towards death. That authentic being is being that is sort of staring death in the face and not avoiding the reality of death. Yes. That authentic living is, in some sense, a constant contemplation of mortality without wanting to hasten that process. Students, it seems to me that the most difficult thing to do is to get over a sense of separation. Isn't that what this is about? Interdependence depends on separation. And if you could give that up, then you could relate to a totality. But how does one do that? Trungpa, you don't have to know how to do it. It just happens. There is no special care or, quote, idiot compassion, unquote, from the teacher or the teaching. You simply have to work it out. You have to acknowledge that you are a lonely person, a person alone, treading on the path. Student, but doesn't the sense of aloneness or loneliness contradict the idea of totality? Trungpa, absolutely not. If you realize you are a lonely person, then you feel the totality of the whole space in which you are lonely or alone. It amounts to the same thing, absolutely the same thing. You can't feel alone unless you feel the totality of the whole thing. There is no help coming from anywhere at all. You have to make your own individual journey, which is purely based on you. That goes without saying. Student, that's not the same thing as ordinary loneliness, then. Trungpa, there is no such thing as ordinary loneliness. Loneliness is one thing. There is always space. We are going to introduce discussion groups tomorrow, which could be extraordinarily important at this point. They will provide an opportunity for people to relate with each other and express their chaos and confusion in terms of the Mandala Principle. They will be able to open themselves and discuss their ideas. So, commentary, our discussion group is our chat. So, when any comments that you post here or on TikTok or YouTube, that will be an opportunity for people to relate with each other and to express your chaos and confusion in terms of the Mandala Principle. Okay? You'll be able to, and I and you will be able to open ourselves and discuss our ideas. But I want you to be able to talk with each other, not just with me. The situation we have is that our philosophers and yogis are at war. The yogis think the philosophers are bullshitting, and the philosophers think the yogis are bullshitting. As a result, at this point, we are unable to establish a total living teaching, which would mean not rejecting either of those. So what we are trying to do is establish some link between the two, so that the approaches of both philosophers and yogis could both be regarded as valid. Some technical and intellectual understanding is important, and your experiential situation is also important. Working those two together is extraordinarily possible. Okay? So when he says the yogis and the philosophers, saying like, we have this, quote, bullshit idea that East is East and West, and ever the twain shall mean, and the yogic tradition of contemplation versus the philosophical tradition of like rational, logical explanation. What he's saying is that the Western classical philosophical tradition and the so-called Eastern meditation-based, contemplative traditions, that we can bring them together. And this is what I'm trying to do in my music, in my artistic work, in my life, and also in these talks. We're trying to contrast and synthesize the ideas that we understand coming from both Eastern and Western and modern traditions. Actually, 3 points, because the great wisdom of the Western past, the great wisdom of the ongoing Eastern traditions, and contemporary science. All right. And getting back to the text here, the expectation is that eventually I won't have to give any more seminars. You'll be able to help yourselves. Not only that, but you will be able to develop American Buddhism to teach other people, to teach the rest of the world. In fact, you'll be able to go back to the Tibetans or the Indians and teach them what their earlier understanding was all about and work with them. As far as I personally am concerned, I have tremendous trust in your participation in this work, and it means a lot to me that we are finally able to work together on the basic sanity level, that we are able to set up some solid ground, enabling you to help your whole world, not purely in terms of religion, but also in terms of concrete living situations. Participation in the discussion groups tomorrow will be an expression of acceptance that we are going to work together, as opposed to your simply being here to pick up something, some spark of knowledge, and take it back home and maybe write a fat book on it. The situation doesn't work that way. It very much needs sharing. So please take part in the discussion groups and also the meditation practice in our community here. It is also part of the seminar. It is very important to give in to the irritations and frustrations that take place in meditation practice. Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. So I want to echo those same comments in our chat thread comments here on YouTube and on TikTok, is that the situation very much needs sharing. So please take part in discussion groups and in practice. So in the chat and in bringing your undistracted attention to the patterns of sound and images, and that's also part. And then everything that comes up, the chaos, the irritation, the frustration, the annoyance with other people, with yourself, that all becomes part of it and becomes part of what we bring to the situation. So I think that's it for today. I think, I'm going back and forth between these sort of historical transcripts from 1972 and then my commentary today, and I think we'll continue with this as much as we can. But I do expect that in our next episode of the podcast that we will be reading and giving commentary on Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. And again, we're looking at what that means in terms of our understanding of literary interpretation, of the idea of the parable, the idea of allegory, of the active interpretation of metaphors and allegories as an essential part of our relationship to the words, to written language altogether, as well as to spoken language, and how that is essential to the artistic process and our appreciation of art. So I think that'll be all today on Art is the Church of God the Creator. And this is Gregory Muna, aka Master Moo, wishing you a great day and a joyful UK bank holiday, US Labor Day, wherever it is, wherever you are. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Back to school. It's back to school for us all. And so let's get those brains activated, and see you soon.